probably many of you saw information on our website and in the paper on Steve. But Steve is a novelist and nonfiction author. He just has written about organizations in China and several books on Colorado. Tonight he is here to speak about his latest book, which is Damnation. So let's welcome Steve Grace.
Okay. Hello. I kind of like that microphone. It's like karaoke style. It's going to be so much fun. Well, hey, thank you all for being here. And God, it's great to be back. So I lived here for about a year, and I left almost a year ago to the day. And I was driving down Rabbit Ears Pass this afternoon and looking down at this beautiful valley, which is like 15 shades of green, as you can see out there, and thinking, why did I ever leave? I should have stayed. Maybe I'll stay this time. I don't know if there are any, is Explore hiring? Maybe I can get my old job. But it's great to be back. So Sarah, thank you for this opportunity to come back here. And so we're going to talk a little bit about water. Wow, yeah. So a few years ago, I was spending a lot of time in China. I published a book about the urban transformation of Shanghai as a build-up to the 2010 World Expo, and I wanted to write another book about China. But an editor I worked with before on books about the American West said, Steve, I think there are enough books about China out there. I think you should write a book about water. Now, my first thought was, no wonder the book publishing industry is in trouble. This just sounded like a preposterous idea to me. I wasn't a water expert, and the idea of me writing a book about water seemed like a really bad idea for me, for my publisher, for readers. But I thought, well, okay, I'll look into it. Now, one of the first things I did was I finally sat down and read this book called Cadillac Desert. Now, who's read Cadillac Desert? All right, lots of hands here. Now, who's really read Cadillac Desert? Who's read that thing from cover to cover? All the detail. All right, a few hands here. You get gold stars. I never have. In the past, I sort of skimmed it so I could pretend like I'd read it and talk about it at cocktail parties. So that was the first thing I did. I sat down and actually read it cover to cover, and I was a better person for it. I think it's like the Ulysses of environmental books. Everyone agrees that it's groundbreaking and important, but while a lot of people say that they've read it, very few have actually persevered from cover to cover. But along with that project, I sat down and started reading the great water journalism in high country news. And I started reading the peer-reviewed science papers on the Western Water Assessment website, books about water law, and so on. Now, what I found is that there's an enormous amount of information that's been published about water in the American West. But most of it's written by experts, right? Most of it's written by historians, by scientists, by engineers. And most books about water are deadly boring. You thought I was going to say dry, didn't you? And it's a shame these books are so dry because water is fascinating. Water moves through our bodies, through the world we inhabit, through the societies we construct. When we explore water, we explore everything. When I began my research, I realized that water is intimately connected with everything I love about the West. I was drawn to the West because of skiing, and I made my living here first as a rafting guide many years ago, and then I made my living taking at-risk youth and people with disabilities on river trips and wilderness adventures. And I loved doing that. My first book was based on those experiences. It was a novel about two characters drawn together in an unlikely friendship by their mutual love of rivers. So water had played such a large role in my life in the West, and I realized that I had essentially taken it for granted. So I set out to change that. I decided to write Damnation and Enrich Water, not as an expert, but as a citizen of the West, curious about its past and concerned about its future. My aim in writing the book was to take readers with little or no prior knowledge about Western water on an enjoyable journey, a pleasurable journey, to raise their level of water literacy. Now, how many of you have learned a second language? Okay, a few hands there. When I began my research on water, I ran into terms like prior appropriation, the public trust doctrine, paleoclimatology. It was like learning a new language. There's a legal category of water in Colorado known as not non-tributary groundwater. Let me say that again. not non-tributary groundwater. Now, making sense of how that double negative differs from, say, tributary groundwater was, for me, about as challenging as figuring out the 4 zones of Mandarin, which I had to do for the book I wrote prior to Damnation. Now I'm working in Brazil, trying to learn Brazilian Portuguese, and I'll tell you what, water literacy is sort of, it's on a level all its own. It's every bit as challenging as a foreign language. And this is a problem, because if people don't speak the strange language of Western water, then it's really difficult to participate in the conversations about how we manage our most precious resource, right? And once you gain a level of fluency in water, you start to figure out some of the basic terminology and principles, and you begin to develop a deep appreciation for the resource. Now, here in Colorado, we're fortunate to have a governor who appreciates the importance of water. Now, this might be partly due to the fact that he's a beer brewer. What's the most important ingredient in beer? Right? Barley, hops, those things are important, but water, right? Every brewmaster says that good beer always begins with good water. That's why Colorado has so many fantastic breweries. And I think we can all agree that if water is the most important ingredient in beer, then water is clearly our most precious resource. And so if you remember nothing else tonight, if you're awake for this part, remember this: a water crisis is a beer crisis. Tell your friends. We'll discuss it at the bars afterwards. So the West's most important feature is aridity. Scholars identify the 100th meridian as the place where the West begins. Now, this line of longitude runs roughly through the center of the Dakotas and down to the Texas Panhandle. So east of this meridian, the climate is so dry it's built there's abundant water, abundant precipitation. But west of the 100th meridian, the climate is so dry that we've built massive dams and diversion systems and mined aquifers of their fossil water to sustain our fragile farms and cities in this thirsty land. Simply put, the West begins where moisture tapers off and dryness takes over. Or better yet, we can think of it this way. Westerners visiting the East had commented that they couldn't see the rivers because they were so full of water. And Mark Twain famously fell into a California river and came out all dusty. So water is scarce in the West. And the scarcity has always bred conflict as people fight over the most precious resource. Across the frontier, when our nation was pushing westward, people were murdered over access to rivers and springs. And these water wars, the West water wars, are the stuff of legend, right? Some of the West's most iconic stories, from the novel The Virginian, to the movie Shane, to the Broadway musical Oklahoma, to the film noir classic Chinatown, center around conflicts over scarce water. And water conflicts continue to this day, whether it's farmers in the South Platte Basin who divert river water, battling farmers who pump water from the aquifer, or the controversies surrounding water use for fracking, or thirsty cities on the Front Range fighting with western slope communities over rivers, or states squabbling over the right to use the Colorado River. We've all heard about these issues a lot because of the current droughts or past droughts. It's a little unclear where we are right now. It doesn't look like a drought out there right now. It's like all those shades of green. Fortunately, we had that late season snowpack, all those storms that bolstered the snowpack, so that's a good thing. But even if we get through this season, there are definitely droughts out there on the horizon. If we can't come up with collaborative solutions to managing our most important resource, the West water wars had the potential to become much worse. Here's why. Paleoclimatologists, so these are scientists who reconstruct what the climate was like before we could measure precipitation, have found that the climate of the West, before we settled here, was much drier than it is today. It was plagued by mega droughts, droughts so severe and so sustained they make the Dust Bowl or the droughts we find ourselves in recent memory look positively lush by comparison. We settled the West during a moist anomaly. The modern urbanized West, as we know, was based on a climactic fluke. The region will almost certainly become more harsh as it reverts to this drier norm that existed before we built our cities here. And superimposed on these natural climate fluctuations is anthropogenic or human-caused climate change. Scientists warn that the West will continue heating up, and snowpack across the region will continue to shrink. Now, snowpack isn't just important for skiing, right? It stores the water that allows our civilization to survive in the arid West. And snowpack is shrinking at an alarming rate, creating a dire challenge to our water supplies. We're also depleting aquifers at an alarming rate. Stores of water underground that took nature millennia to fill are being emptied in half a human lifetime. So historians tell us that the scarcity of water in the American West has caused tremendous conflict in the past. Scientists tell us we'll probably have less water here in the future than we have now. And demographers and economists, they tell us that the western United States, especially Colorado, will continue to experience explosive population growth. So we have increasing demand on a decreasing supply of the one substance essential for life. Now, we can run out of oil and make use of other energy sources, right? There are no alternatives to water. Our food supply, our cities, our industries, our ecosystems, our economy, our lives, everything depends on water. Even tweeting. The server farms that make it possible for you to tweet about how much you're enjoying this event depend on water to cool them, and it takes massive amounts of water to manufacture the microchips that run our virtual world. So water is everywhere, even in your smartphones. So recent arrivals to Los Angeles or Phoenix, surrounded by water parks and golf courses, have been known to mutter, "I heard somewhere this was a desert." Water managers across the West have done such a superb job of supplying cities with water, they have created an illusion of perfusion, which can make us take this resource for granted. But the first explorers in the West encountered a parched wilderness very different from the West we know today, with its swimming pools and lush lawns. And originally the West was considered too dry to settle. The region that stretches from the 100th meridian to the Rockies was known as the Great American Desert. And for many years, no one dreamed of establishing farms and cities here. But manifest destiny and a belief born of pseudoscience and religious faith that rain falls flat convinced the nation to spread toward the Pacific. Now, the theory that rain would increase as we move west, well, that's a nice idea, but it was, of course, patently false. And John Wesley Powell knew this. So Powell was famous for being the first person to lead an expedition down the Colorado River. He was also one of the most accomplished scientists of his day. He warned that the West needed a water plan based on the best science, not on blind faith. But politicians and tycoons intoxicated with dreams of wealth and empire ignored Powell's sober advice about respecting the limited amount of water available in the West, and the nation began a building frenzy. We dammed damn near every river in the western United States, most of them many times over. The story of the West is above all the story of dams. Dams larger by many orders of magnitude than any civilization before us had built allowed nature to be rearranged in the region on a scale unprecedented in world history, providing the water and the power necessary for our nation to surge westward and create one of the most productive economies on the planet. These dams rise like monuments in the deserts of the West. They are America's castles, its cathedrals, its pyramids. Long after our skyscrapers have collapsed and our cities have crumbled, the dams of the West, such as Hoover and Grand Coulee, will most likely still be standing. It's important to note that these great dams of the West had a profound effect not just on the western states, but on our entire nation. While America was mired in the Great Depression, Hoover Dam became the largest public works project in history, and it and other massive dam projects helped get the economy back on track. And Hoover Dam was an engineering triumph. Nothing like it had ever been conceived, much less built. It contains more material than the Great Pyramid at Giza. Its weight is such that it deforms the crust of the earth and can generate its own earthquakes. And it is beautiful. The dam's facade was designed in 1930s Art Deco style. It became the largest piece of public art on the planet. The massive amount of hydroelectricity produced by dams on the Columbia River was essential to manufacturing aluminum for the airplanes that defeated Germany and Japan in World War II. And Columbia River hydropower ran the reactors that produced the plutonium for the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan. World War II might have turned out very differently if we hadn't built giant dams on the Columbia River. Now, financing these massive dam projects in the West became an integral part of the American political process. So much so that Dan Beard, former Bureau of Reclamation Commissioner, said that without using pork barrel water projects in the legislative process, the Civil Rights Act never would have passed. President Carter's principal attempt to curtail the federal dam building bureaucracy in the West was as much a factor in his one-term presidency as the Iran hostage crisis. Carter stated, "In the arid West and across the entire nation, we must begin to recognize that water is not free. It is a precious resource. The cornerstone of future water policy should be conservation and wise management." But wise management and conservation went over in the West like lead balloons filled with chunks of granite. Fiercely independent Westerners demanded that the federal government spare no expense in building dams that helped them maintain their fierce independence. Dams were built by the thousands all over the West, turning parched landscapes into some of the most productive farmland on the planet and providing a level of food security unprecedented in world history. Massive dams and diversion systems put a stop to devastating floods and allowed small outposts such as Los Angeles and Phoenix and Las Vegas to drink from distant rivers and develop into thriving cities. The total mastery of mighty rivers was a human dream that had spanned millennia, and in the American West, in the 20th century, it was finally fulfilled. Now, these giant dams in the West also had tremendous costs. They consumed massive amounts of taxpayer dollars and often led to wasteful spending as the projects ran up to 4 times their initial cost projections. You could pilot a 747 through the Bureau of Reclamation's budgets and not bump into a piece of truthful math. And these dam mega projects put giant agribusinesses on the public dole instead of fostering small family farms as the legislation authorizing the project had originally intended. It was a complete subversion of that process, of that original intent of the legislation. And it started to look an awful lot like socialism for the rich. As an example, when the Bureau of Reclamation's gargantuan Central Valley project was completed in California, the Southern Pacific Railroad, the largest private landowner in the state of California, became the largest beneficiary of the largest water project in world history, and corporations such as Exxon and Getty Oil operated mega farms irrigated by taxpayer dollars. And of course, there were tremendous environmental costs to building these dams. After our dam building spree reinvented the watersheds, farms, and cities of the West, only a handful of rivers such as the Yellowstone and the Yampa still flowed freely. Relatively freely. We're going to talk about this in a minute. It gets complicated, right, Charlotte? Charlotte's going to help me explain this. The damage to the natural world caused by the dams of the West led to epic battles between the federal government's dam building bureaucracy and organizations like the Sierra Club trying to preserve the last few scraps of wild rivers in the West. And these battles gave rise to the modern environmental movement in America. A lot of this happened right here in the state of Colorado, in Echo Park, in Dinosaur National Monument. So now I'm going to read an excerpt, a brief excerpt from my book, from a chapter titled, "What We Have Lost." What I have lost is my place in this book. Here it is. Some believe dams should be built by any means necessary and at any cost, so important they are to the West, a land of drought and drenching snowmelt that gathers in thunderous flood. Others believe not a single dam should ever have been raised, and even Hoover was a colossal mistake. Perhaps the truth, as it so often does, lies somewhere in the middle. Dams are not inherently good or bad. They are the product of people's thinking writ large, and as such, sometimes they are incandescently brilliant, sometimes tragically flawed. Stand atop a dam and feel its solid permanence. Gravity pulls the concrete of the pyramidal structure toward the bedrock at its base. See the curved arch that directs the great pressure of the water against the bulky cliffs that flank the dam. Hear the powerhouse rumble far below. Enter it and walk across metal grating that vibrates with the roar of the dynamo. Listen to the water tumble down the penstock and rush through the spiral piping of the scroll case. See the liquid push against bladed wheels that turn the turbine shafts and spin the magnets of the rotor, building the current to set a city aglow. Reach your hand toward the polished casing of the turbine. Feel the energy within. That the human mind can conceive of a structure to hold back a river and generate such power is staggering. In a once wild land of treeless prairie and endless sand, cities now shimmer in the night. Tour guides at dams love to talk about tonnage of concrete and kilowatt hours of power. America's dams are impressive, to be sure, but the re-engineered water courses of the West are sublime rivers, the same way that McDonald's food is haute cuisine. For an increasingly large segment of the American public, dams have come to symbolize misplaced faith in harnessing natural resources. The great faces of concrete now evoke an era of engineering excess, when the nation's wild bounty, its plains that shudder beneath the hooves of bison, its rivers crammed so full of salmon a person could walk across the water on their backs, its skies thrumming with the wings of waterfowl, was ravaged in the name of progress and replaced with factory farms and shopping malls. Large growers and their political supporters persuaded the country to raise walls of spellbinding size to control the flow of water. Their efforts yielded thousands of dams that plugged the rivers of the West, spilling water across the wasteland, bringing forth life from stone. While the banks of rivers were grazed bare by cows, the desert grew a green fur of grass to mimic the lawns we left behind in rainier places. We ate salad in winter. We watched fountains cough precious water into the sky. Restless and wanting more, we left our freshly paved cities to trace back into the last patches of wilderness and found them barren bison and salmon and birds. And now, the winged statues above Hoover Dam seem not so much narratives of triumph over nature as mementos of a blind faith in dams, a misplaced belief in their potential to help forge a perfect world. Glen Canyon Dam is just another concrete slab in the desert, one more attempt to fill the world with awe. The novelty wore thin long ago. The shining dream of technological utopia grows dim in the glare of the West suburban streetlights. Now multitudes flock to the halls of Congress, clamoring for the barricades to come tumbling down, for the rivers to run free. So now we've moved away from building these monumental structures, and we're actually tearing some of them down to restore rivers. Has anyone heard about the Elwha in Oregon? A few people, and the Condit Dam in Washington State. There's a lot of this happening. It's very interesting. I'm working as a consultant, kind of helping out on a film that Patagonia's producing, which has an amazing title. I love the title. It's Damnation, right? Just a coincidence. Yeah, so that's definitely kind of where we are now in terms of these infrastructure projects. And now we're focusing more on conservation to cope with the crisis of water scarcity in the West. Once we built story dams that dazzled kings and dropped the jaws of pharaohs, now we install waterless urinals. Not quite as glamorous, but it works. Conserving our water supplies is absolutely essential, but it's important to point out that conservation can only do so much. If the West's shrinking water supply is the elephant in the room, then growth is a mastodon playing a bass drum. We cannot ignore the issue of population growth. If all the water freed up by conservation in the West is simply gobbled up by more growth, then the region will be right back where it started, in crisis. Growth, according to eminent Western historian Donald Worcester, is a word that for some Americans is, quote, more sacred than God or country, unquote. But we have to peg population growth in the West for our limited water supplies. Now, we can do this with smart economics, pricing water so that the true costs of using it are reflected in what water users pay. It's our most precious resource, but it flows from our taps virtually free. This has to change. And we need to develop decentralized infrastructure, not massive diversion projects to move water from one river basin to another. We need to encourage the participation of resident citizens in the management of their watersheds. And protecting river ecosystems and aquifers needs to be assigned as high a priority as providing water to agriculture and cities. But better policies and planning are only part of the solution. Preventing the West water crisis from becoming a catastrophe will take education, a lot of education, and it will take a shift in the water ethics of individuals. While I was writing that book, I sat down with a real estate developer in Denver, And he told me, Steve, the only thing I know about water is it comes out of my faucet. This kind of thinking, or rather not thinking about water, has to change. So I'm going to read one more excerpt from my book, if you will indulge me. We're near the end. We're in the home stretch. Hopefully you're still awake. We'll discuss the beer issue after I finish reading this at a local bar. We insist on more salmon and clean, free-flowing streams, but then we open our taps without considering where the water comes from or the consequences of letting our faucets run. How we use water in our daily lives determines, to a large extent, the fate of the West rivers. If we are sloppy with water use in our homes and businesses, streams will languish and aquifers will atrophy. To use water carefully and sparingly is to understand the relationship between our taps and the sources that supply them. It is to promote the health of the watersheds that sustain us. It is to acknowledge that every glass of water we drink is a gift, every garden we grow a blessing. The water crisis in the West has been caused not only by bad policies and poor planning, but by the wasteful water use of citizens. Government policies and Herculean efforts to build dams and pipelines won't end it. What will keep the West water crisis from becoming a catastrophe is millions of people installing low-flow plumbing fixtures in their homes and businesses, millions of buckets of rainwater harvested for backyard gardens, millions of faucets turned off for a few moments when parents teach their children how to soap and rinse their hands, and millions of parents taking their children to the shingle banks of rivers to hold in their hands the jeweled cases of caddisfly larvae as the backs of leaping fish flash in the sun and kingfishers call from the sedges. Most of us have grown used to monitoring and curtailing our energy consumption, in part because of pricing that discourages wasteful use, and in part because of concern over the impact our actions have on the environment. And we are increasingly paying attention to how the food we eat affects the world around us. Wendell Berry's famous formulation, "Eating is an agricultural act," is reaching a wide audience as Michael Pollan and others spread the food movement through America. Many of us are now starting to understand that each time we consume a meal, we are involved in farming. When we purchase food, we are voting with our dollars, sending signals to the marketplace about what kind of agriculture we support and how we want the planet's resources to be used to grow, produce, and deliver the things we eat. Using water is an ecological act. Just as food doesn't simply appear in cellophane packages in grocery stores, water doesn't just flow from our faucets. We sip from wild rivers. We bathe in ancient aquifers. If we choose to luxuriate in long showers and gorge ourselves on feedlot beef, it should come as no surprise when the West riverbeds turn dry as gravel roads. We should expect the skeletons of fish to bleach in the sun and marshlands, once riotous with birds, to fall silent. Each time we let sprinklers hiss across lawns, we send a signal to politicians and water managers that we need more dams and diversions to bring us more supply. Each time we tear up water-hungry turf and replace it with plants that thrive in dry climates, we vote for wild streams. But conservation and approved efficiency measures, whether mandated by governments or voluntarily adopted by citizens, can only do so much. Eventually, if the West continues on its present trajectory of rampant growth, it will run out of conservation, just as it has run out of good dam sites, and then the region will have to face the insufferable limits imposed by nature. At some point, politicians in the West are going to have to find the courage to rise above partisan posturing and to take on powerful agribusiness interests in squabbling cities and states. They're going to have to tell the truth, which is simply this: a region with limited precipitation cannot support unlimited growth. And the public in the West is going to have to pay attention. Phoenix probably won't turn to ashes like the Hohokam civilization, but its future may not include green fairways and gushing fountains. Its citizens may have to stop pretending they're in a Costa Rican rainforest and accept that they live in a desert, and the desert is very dry. Residents of California's metropolises may have to put aside their self-congratulatory belief in their environmental progressiveness and take responsibility for the widespread damage the cancerous growth of their cities has caused and continues to cause the waterscape of the West. And all of us, whether we live in Marin County or Cheyenne, in Missoula or Los Angeles, need to look through the smog of our self-righteousness and start conserving more water and paying more for the water we do use. We need to stop blaming the Bureau of Reclamation, politicians, city planners, water managers, environmentalists, farmers, ranchers, everyone and everything but ourselves, and make fundamental changes to the way we live. Even more to the point, perhaps we need to adjust how we think about our right to live wherever we want, even in places that lack the water to sustain us. Whether we plant our yard with bluegrass or cover it with cacti, whether we leave the hose running while we wash our car, or conscientiously turn off the tap each time we brush our teeth, all of us who live in the West are complicit in its aquifers emptying and its rivers running dry. By choosing to make lives for ourselves west of the 100th meridian, we are part of the problem. We each have a water footprint, and however lightly we might tread, footprints in the desert leave a mark. So a lot of you probably already know this, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, but I'd be remiss in not mentioning that Friends of the Yampa, our friend Charlie here representing that fine organization, and the Yampa Valley Sustainability Council are working very hard to raise awareness about issues that surround the Yampa. And the Yampa is considered one of the last rivers of the American West without any major dams or diversions. It's considered the last river in the Colorado River Basin, which is a 7-state region, an enormous swath of the North American continent. It's the very last one without any major dams or diversions. Now, obviously, there's some dams out there. I've stood in the tailwater fishery below Stagecoach, and that's a dam. But hydrologists tell us that the river's hydrograph, basically the way the river would flow if left to its own devices, its natural flood and drought stages, that hydrograph is relatively intact. So we have a unique opportunity here, a very special opportunity to protect and preserve the last major river in the Colorado River Basin, one of the last free-flowing rivers in the American West, to protect that and preserve that in a relatively intact state and pass that along to future generations. There are plans on the table looking at the Yampa. Guess what? The Front Range continues to grow. We're looking at a doubling of population in the state of Colorado by mid-century. I sit in gridlock traffic. I just live on the Front Range. I try and drive down to downtown Denver and sit in gridlock traffic, or I do the I-70 commute back on Sundays from skiers, and I think, really? We're going to have twice as many people here? And the Front Range is going to need more water. There aren't any definite plans on the table right now, but there are things you'll hear about called the Yampa Pumpback, the Maybell Pumpback project. Eyes are on the Yampa to potentially divert it to the Front Range. As the Front Range grows, it will continue to look for ways to stick straws into distant rivers, and you find folks here in the Yampa Valley will be confronted with that at some point. So I would encourage you to get educated about that, start thinking about it, and whatever you decide about it, it's fine. But what I really want to do is get people involved in the conversation and have them become aware of these issues and become water literate so you can participate in a substantive way in these conversations. We have this wonderful roundtable, this basin roundtable approach in Colorado. Has anyone participated in this? Has anyone been to the... All right, great. So, and it's a great idea, right? I mean, it's this idea that people within watersheds get to sit down at the table and have a say in how their water is managed. But my concern is I talk to a lot of people who go to these meetings, and if they're not, if they're not water attorneys, if they're not completely fluent in the strange language of water, they feel like their voice sometimes isn't being heard in a way that they'd like it to be heard. So it's imperative upon all of us to get educated about these issues, to develop a basic level of water fluency, to identify what values are important to us, whatever those are, whether it's agriculture, whether it's urban development, whether it is preserving rivers in their natural state, and be part of that conversation. Because if you're not part of that conversation, if you're not water literate, we have what looks like a democratic process, but my concern is it's a simulacrum of the democratic process. It's basically just business as usual. So get educated, get aware, figure out what's important to you, and become part of the conversation. We talk about water being our most precious resource, but really it's you. It's people like you with education, with intelligence, with creativity, and with passion for solving the West's most pressing problems. You're this region's most important resource. How we manage our water, both here in the Yampa Valley, throughout the American West, will define our future. And in order to meet our many water challenges, we need concerned, engaged citizens with talent in the sciences, law, policy, urban planning, agriculture, engineering, economics, journalism, education, business. There are so many opportunities to get involved and be part of the solution to one of the great problems of the 21st century, managing our most crucial resource for a sustainable future. So that concludes my presentation. I thank you very much for your kind attention. I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you have.
Yes, sir. Stephen, thank you for your presentation and your awareness of these issues surrounding the AMP. But I'm not sure everyone is fully aware that the governor earlier this month released an executive order directing the Colorado Water Conservation Board to prepare a water plan by, I believe it's the end of 2015. This is to try to bring to some culmination the work that's been done by the roundtables around the state of Colorado over the last 8 years and give some kind of definitive plan. And what we know right now is that that has moved far enough along that the Yampa River Pump Back is one of 5 identified projects that need to be prioritized for delivery of water to fill this gap between what we need for the future projected growth in the state of Colorado and the available water through the existing water delivery systems that we have today. So there's a little bit more urgency than we've had in the past, as the governor has just thrown down the gauntlet and said that he will prepare this water plan and it will include feedback from the round table. This is a little more urgency than we've seen in the past. I would expect to see the Yampa River Pump Back discussed much more seriously in the near future, and I want to make sure everyone's aware of that.
Yeah, thank you very much. So are you involved with the YVSC process, or with the Interface and Compact Committee? And
I'm on the Yampa Conservancy District. I'm on the Friends of Yampa. I attend the 1177 roundtable meetings.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, so please, everyone get involved in that process. It's so important. Thank you for bringing that up. There is that sense of urgency now, and I commend the governor for having this sort of sense of urgency. I think it's good to take all this information that's been gathered through this roundtable process. We don't have the time or probably the attention span to get into all the minutiae of what the Interbasin Compact Committee entails and these round basin discussions, but please, if you're interested, get involved in that. There's a study called SWSI, or SWATI, which looks at the statewide water supply initiative and looks at the demographic projections. That's where we get that doubling of population, which again, to me, is just astounding. And this tremendous gap between supply and demand, right? This increasing demand or the decreasing supply of the one substance essential for life. One thing that's connected to everything that we care about in the West, and everything that makes life worth living here, and makes it such a special place. So, yeah, thank you for that.
My question is where you didn't want to go, and that is some of the anatomy of how many round tables are there. Is there there's 9 across the state, so is it a regionalization plan, or is it a watershed plan?
It initiated, I think it was Russell George's bill, House Bill 1177, it was House Bill 1177. It challenged each of the 8 major river drainages, and the 9th basin is the Denver metro area itself, to produce some type of an assessment of the needs and water availability within each basin, and then to encourage a collaborative approach that, like say the South Platte might come and approach the Yampa and say, well, we sure need your water, and we'd say, well, we'd sure be glad to help you out. Sort of a philosophy. It's built on a consensus building model.
And really a different model from the past. We have all this sort of Western or water wars in the past. There's been so much contention and conflict. So the idea is to kind of move us from a trajectory of past conflict toward a future of collaboration and cooperation. And we have a very nice concrete example of that process playing out. It's called the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement, which was finalized in 2012. Are we sure we want to get into all this today? We're going to start drifting on. I'm going to drift off here in a minute. But it was this historic agreement between the western slope and the eastern slope, which have always been at odds, right? Battling over water. Denver water sat down with the western slope water entities at the negotiating table. It wasn't litigated. It didn't go to court. All the stakeholders in the process came to a collaborative agreement about how to move forward, how to make sure that Denver Water has the water it needs for the Denver metropolitan area, and also that the West Slope communities get to sort of retain some control over their water. And so we do have some, I think that's a really nice outcome of that process. And hopefully we'll see kind of more collaborative efforts like that.
How old is 1122?
1177 is 8 years. Yeah, but it has no statutory authority. It was a collaborative model. That's why the order from the governor is to the Colorado Water Conservation Board, the statutory authority for water in the state. It's their responsibility to cooperate with these other groups and produce this water availability plan for the state of Colorado.
There are great resources online too if you want to get educated about that. It's really good, kind of user-friendly for the layperson. So if you just kind of Google that, the YVSC Interbasin Compact Committee, you can get some great information.
Yeah, the YVSC is true members from each of the 9 different roundtables. It has a total of 25, and the rest are our governor appointees from the Water Conservation Board and senior staff. That forms the YVSC, which is supposedly the group that convenes and brings together all the collective knowledge from the different basins and figure this all out.
Yeah, and okay, so now I'm trying to stay away from kind of the minutiae of water law and stuff, but if you really want to look into kind of YAMPA issues, one of the things, the YAMPA's trump card is basically that we have downstream obligations. So 2/3 of the water in the state of Colorado we can't use. We can only use 1/3 of the water that originates here. 2/3 we're obligated to send downstream as part of this thing called the Colorado River Compact, which was passed in 1922, and all sorts of other esoteric agreements, international treaties with Mexico, legislation, Supreme Court decisions. But the YAMPA's trump card may be that we need to keep that water in the YAMPA moving downstream to meet those obligations. So it may have nothing to do with environmental values or keeping the YAMPA a nice place to live. It may come down to the minutiae of very dry water law. So that's a good example where you have to kind of get educated about these things, even though sometimes it's horrendously painful. Yes. Paul, right? All right.
Thank you. What comes up for me around this discussion that Ken and Jim were talking about is the fact that it doesn't matter what these committees, these roundtables come up with unless the issue of population control is an integral part, and I don't see how that is going to ever happen.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. I mean, that's been kind of my mission to talk about that. So a lot of people don't talk about that. Some of my favorite conservation organizations, when I go and talk with them, they'll say, we can't talk about growth. Growth is going to happen, and they'll basically accept those projections out there saying that we're looking at doubling the state population. But I say, let's really look at that. And what does it look like? What does smart growth look like if we are going to grow? Should that be a dense urban conglomeration where water is used wisely? I think so. I think we could maybe put a moratorium on the Front Range on building suburban and exurban sprawl until we kind of get our water system in place, until we figure out how to bail ourselves out of water bankruptcy and move forward in an intelligent way. Now, one thing that's very heartening to me is that the governor's on record is talking about growth. And this is very unusual for a Western politician to do. And quite frankly, I think it was very brave of Governor Hickenlooper to sort of broach this topic at a water conference. He said, maybe it's time we start looking at the issue of growth. Is there an upper limit to growth? Are there limits to our water supply? Can we match growth to water supply? And just sort of proposing that and talking about that, I think is, it's kind of a shame that is remarkable, but that is remarkable, and I commend him for doing that. And I hope we can take that seriously, kind of take his lead and really start having that discussion. Because again, we get back to this idea that, a lot of this goes back to manifest destiny. I think we used to have this idea that rain follows the cloud, we move west, the water will magically fall because we're the chosen people. And, most of us don't believe that anymore. I hope not. Does anyone believe that? But we've replaced it with this thing that's every bit as pernicious, and it's basically this belief that technology will free us from nature's constraints, right? Through techno-magic, somehow we'll make more water. And everywhere I go, people say, oh, it's not a problem. We have floods in the Mississippi, we'll just send that water here. But that takes a lot of energy, right? So then we're trading oil for water, and to use energy, it takes water. But they say desalination, but desalination takes an enormous amount of energy. So I'm kind of rambling now. So another question. So I think you, sir, had your hand up first. Yes.
I'll just talk aloud, okay?
Okay.
And then try to be brief. The question that comes up to me, kind of on a macro and maybe a micro basis, is, since you mentioned trajectory earlier, as the population has grown substantially in Colorado over 30 years, 40 years, whatever number might be used, has the per capita consumption been tracked, and which direction is it going?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. It has gone down quite a bit. I don't have the statistics in front of me. There was a point when I used to know that, but it has gone down quite a bit, and I think Denver Water should be commended for that. A lot of times we get into this antagonism between the West Slope, the Eastern Slope, and Denver Water kind of becomes this evil entity out there. But if you take a hard look at what Denver Water's done, post-1990, anyone remember this huge dam project that was proposed? It was vetoed in 1990, right? 2-4 dam, right? And when that was vetoed by the EPA, basically Denver Water was forced to start doing conservation and enhanced efficiency measures to make up for that gap between supply and demand. And it really changed. There was a gentleman by the name of Chip Berry, sort of a legendary figure there, took over the helm of Denver Water and started moving that agency in a direction where conservation was really embraced, and really a lot of aggressive conservation and enhanced efficiency measures. So a long-winded way of saying, yes, per capita use has gone down significantly on the Front Range. We still have the issue there. More than half, approximately 55% of the water that's consumed on the Front Range is for Kentucky bluegrass, right? And I, as a resident of the Front Range, really have a problem trading the color green, the ability to see the color green Kentucky bluegrass lawns for a beautiful wild river like the Yampa. I'm not comfortable with that. But Denver Water has a whole argument about that, about why they need to keep water in the lawn, because then in times of drought, they can pull it out, and we can talk about that. But anyway, excellent question. Yes. We need to do a lot more conservation too, I guess, is the point. We need to kind of keep moving in that direction. We need to conserve a lot.
But if I could follow that, just because what concerns me, I guess, is I think everybody probably in this room does something towards conservation, if we're conserving water, or perhaps using water in a better way than they did when they were younger.
Right.
And knew less. Part of me is concerned that the more that is conserved by responsible people,
absolutely,
the more is used by, or there appears to be more available for other uses, and that is all a control issue.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. Go to the head of the class. That's my concern too. And that's where water is inherently different from energy, right? When we conserve energy, there's something inherently virtuous about that. If we lower our carbon footprint, well, that means there's less carbon in the atmosphere. Kind of, we're done, okay? That's all we have to do. Turn off the lights, use more energy-efficient cars. But when it gets to water, yeah, if we conserve more water in our own lives, that's virtuous. But if we're not part of this process, this roundtable process about deciding about how that water is going to be used, so if the water we save is simply gobbled up by more rampant growth, then we're kind of right back where we started. So it's imperative on us as citizens of the West to not just save water in our own lives, but to get involved in the larger conversation about how that water that is saved is used.
I just have to say I'm skeptical about the Denver Water Board's numbers in terms of it going down. Not that they aren't accurate in that, but Denver City and County is only 500,000 people.
Right.
We've got close to 5 million down there. So what's going on in Denver City and County, what they do to save water on the capital use, I don't think is reflected.
No, it's a good point. And when we talk about the Yampa, it's Northern Water. It's the Northern Water Conservancy District that has its eyes on the Yampa. It's actually not Denver. I mean, that's, it's the whole Front Range is, you're right. I mean, there are a lot of moving parts there. It gets confusing. And just because Denver Water is kind of doing the right thing doesn't necessarily mean that Northern Water is. You've been waiting very patiently.
Yeah, thank you. I basically kind of just answered my question, but Brian Warner from Northern Water was basically, he gave a presentation on the watershed last semester, and he was adamant that no western slope water would be diverted to the Front Range. I just find that kind of interesting.
Yeah, wow. That's interesting. I didn't find
even though there already is, Michigan did pulls water from North Park and sends it over Camper Pass.
Yeah.
Down to Fort Collins, and that's how they want it to Blade Reservoir.
He said what? He said no,
He said no Western Slope
Somebody called
water.
Brian Warner. Let's get him on the
I know, right?
No, he probably knows more about the Colorado Big Thompson project than any other living human being. He's an amazing resource.
This is separate from that. This is.
No, I just want to kind of get things across and sort of set that up before I disagree with him. He was actually interviewed by Mark Wiseman for his book Cadillac Husband. He has some great anecdotes about that. He's a very intelligent and thoughtful person, but I couldn't disagree with him more about, I mean, he definitely has a focus, Northern Water definitely has a focus on the Western Slope. They definitely have the rise on the Yampa, and there's something called the Windy Gap Permit Project, which actually Trout Unlimited and a lot of environmental organizations have signed off on. They've been pretty happy with the way Northern's gone about that. But Northern Water is absolutely focused on the Western Slope, to bail themselves out of water bankruptcy.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Sorry, I think you, sir.
So my question, what I want to get to is beyond conservation.
Sure.
What in your research have you seen that looks creative, innovative to
Okay.
have larger impacts? And
Yeah.
what comes to mind for me are things like intermittent supply flows and kind of these lease fallowing programs that have been sampling on the Arkansas down south.
Absolutely, yeah. That's what low super dish. That was my answer.
So I haven't looked at that in years.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to start by saying, in the Rocky Mountains, what are the percentages of users, generally speaking? Ag, residential, mining, industry. I mean, how,
Well, throughout the West, you always hear the figure of 80% goes to agriculture. It's kind of funny, because you never see where that source actually comes from. We just sort of taken it on faith. In the state of Colorado, we generally hear 86%. Sometimes you hear 87% if you round it up.
That's really what I'm getting at.
Yeah, so and that's a huge, we talk about efficiency.
They're going to go after agriculture.
Right, yeah, it's like if I live in on the Front Range and turn off my faucet when I brush my teeth, well, if someone's doing flood irrigation on thousands of acres of alfalfa, it's like, is that really, at the end of the day, does that really accomplish anything? So we have to talk about agricultural efficiency, and of course that's been, you mentioned effective solutions, and there is this idea of, instead of doing just ag to city transfers, but where you can fallow land and sort of do it on a temporary basis, and they've been experimenting with this. This is actually a good outcome of the YVSC roundtable process down around Pueblo, this thing called the Super Ditch, which I know John Stoll, who's the chairman of this YVSC process, is really excited about that. It seems to be one of those rare kind of win-win situations in the West where peace breaks out in the West waterways. That's pretty hopeful. And another thing I love is this project called Prairie Waters in the city of Aurora. And Aurora could have looked at trying to get water rights somewhere, but there really weren't any water rights to get. They could have looked at building a dam or a pipeline, but they built this really clever engineering solution that basically they use their water, clean it to a certain extent, put it back in the river, it goes downstream, they take it back out, clean it, drink it, take it back out. So it's this kind of repeating sort of loop where they're recycling their own water. And it's very smart infrastructure, very high-tech engineering, but just a great, very clever solution that doesn't cause these enormous interruptions to the landscape that trans-mountain diversions do. So there are a couple signs of hope out there.
I've lived here in the Yampa for 25 years, and always my water hero was this man's father, John Fetcher. And so I'd like to see if Jay could answer some or just say what he thinks about our water. I know his dad is no longer with us, but I've always felt he's been taking care of our water for so long.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if Jay...
I'd love to hear that perspective. Yes, please.
Thinks about this whole aspect?
I'm trying to make the corner.
Just aching about it. Just wanting to stand up. Because you have a lot of information from your dad.
Thanks. Quickly, agriculture does, I think, has been appropriated 85% of the water, and that's part of the reason. But I think the critical piece of theirs with our flood irrigation is what it does to the wetlands and how much water we're actually storing in the ground for that. So there's a tremendous return to rivers, even though I'm now irrigating my meadows and filling them up with water. And the other thing I was thinking of as you spoke about growth is one thing my dad said was water never stopped growth, and I think that's true. And I think that's what we're going to have to face.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. The great Western historian Patricia Limerick makes that exact point in her book, Ditch in Time. If anyone, that's a great, after you read mine, you can read her. If you have to read one or the other, read hers. I would. No, that's an excellent point. I think a lot of times in the West we get in this kind of a situation where we end up scapegoating people. A lot of times it's like, well, the Front Range, they've got Kentucky bluegrass, so they're bad. And then, people say, on the Front Range will say, well, it's those, it's those ranchers out there flooding their alfalfa fields. But you're absolutely right. There are tremendous environmental benefits to that kind of flood irrigation. There are those return flows, which can recharge aquifers and put water back into rivers and preserve the ecological values there. And moreover, that can be a buffer against growth. I mean, when we look out there and see those beautiful green hay fields that are being flood irrigated, a lot of people would rather see that instead of subdivisions, right, and ranchettes. We know Justice Hobbs in here, Justice Gregory Hobbs. So he probably knows more about water law in the state of Colorado than any person alive right now. He's forgotten more about water law than I'll ever learn in my entire life. And he's an adamant proponent of leaving water in that state and continuing to do this kind of flood irrigation to keep those beautiful fields intact and to keep that as a buffer against suburban and exurban sprawl. So it's complicated, and I don't really have any tolerance for people that just sort of demonize ranchers and farmers, because they also grow our food. It's like, let's not make an enemy of the people who are feeding us, too.
I'll make one more comment about the irrigation of agricultural water, and that is we have a hay field right outside our house. It's about 20 acres, and it'll grow during the summer 3 tons per acre at a value of $100 a ton. The same water that was needed to grow that hay would take care of 5,000 people for a year.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the challenge we have as agricultural water owners, and also to make everybody aware of the environmental benefit, as you mentioned, of recharging those aquifers and keeping the wetlands going and so forth.
Yeah, thank you. I think it is. Thank you for adding nuance view to when we talk about agriculture and that 86% number we always hear out there. Anyone else? Are we still? Yep.
As I understand, a good portion of that third of the Colorado drainage that leaves Colorado we don't utilize. And I've heard figures of 300,000 acre feet or whatever, which means we've sent down the river and we don't use it. It's really scary if we put that 300,000 acre feet or whatever the number is to work to grow our economy and to get us bigger, we'd really be in trouble.
Absolutely.
And imagine if we developed our maximum development here in Steamboat and Craig and this valley, with all the river water that's going down the Yampa. This place would not be a real nice place to live because it'd be overpopulated. So we're damned if we do, and we're damned if we don't.
Right. Oh, nicely said. That'll be my sequel.
We're glad we don't utilize it right now in Colorado because we'd be a much more popular.
Absolutely, yeah. But again, we get back to this issue. Scientists tell us we're going to have less water in the future than we have now. So yeah, if we build out and use every drop that's available now, that's not going to look so good when we get into that next epic drought 10 years from now. When we get back to a drought like the 2002 drought, then we're really in trouble. And if you want a voice on, I think the most prudent voice on science, climate change, and how it will affect the West water supply, that's Brad Udall, right, of the Udall family. They're like the Kennedys of the West. And Brad Udall, he's an amazing scientist, and you can hear him all over the place. He's probably been here, will be here. Yeah, so we have to keep that in mind. Okay.
There's a most recent study that's come out that was done by the Department of the Interior, and it was just looking at it's a 3-year study on what's going on with the climate change.
This is the Bureau of Reclamation and with the 7 basin, Colorado River Basin State.
Yeah, it was in the entire Colorado River Basin. And they've been using this paleo data that they've developed, which is just, using tree rings and matching it up with current flow data that they have, and they've been able to go back like 1,200 and some years.
Yeah.
What was really interesting is they said that the driest 7-year period in record for the entire 1,200 years was 2000 through 2006.
In the 2,000 year?
They say in the 1,200 years.
Or in the 1,200 years? Huh. I thought it was the year. I thought it was like the year around 1290 or 1300.
Was the 50-year segment, but they said the driest 7-year.
Oh, the driest 7 year. Okay, gotcha. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what that was.
That is fascinating.
Well, I'm just going to, sorry. So I know, let's do one more question, and then I know Steve will be around, and our partners will be around. But I know some of you maybe want to get home to dinner. So let's do one more question, and then Steve will be around after.
I was just wondering, are we, as individuals, allowed to capture rainwater?
Oh, such a good question. I wish I had the law in front of me. It's so complicated, and this is such a great example where something that seems sort of virtuous and common sense, and like, oh, wouldn't that be a nice thing to do? Capture water off of the eaves of our roof to pour on our tomato plants. But we have this system in the West called prior appropriation that goes back to the gold rush days and settling the agrarian frontier, and it says, no, you can't do that because that water, someone owns the rights to that. They may be 100 miles downstream, they may be 300 miles downstream, but that's not your water. But now this was changed by the legislature, and it's incredibly complicated. My understanding is now there is some limited capacity to do that. If you own your property in certain areas, I don't know all the minutiae of the law. And the truth is, I mean, people have been doing this for a long time, and then, you know, I don't think anyone's going to come to your house and like kick your door down because you have a rainwater bucket outside. But it's an excellent question. It's a great illustration of how complicated and how arcane the water laws of the West can be, and how, you know, sometimes we bump up against these laws. It's a legal system that's been in place going all the way back to the California gold rush, and how it doesn't necessarily mesh with contemporary values. Does anyone do rainwater capture?
I'm the water.
Oh, there you go. Okay, so you can answer. So, will you kick her door down?
Yeah.
The actual law is if you have a well on your property.
The actual law is if you have a well on your property and it's a domestic well, then you can use and capture rainwater. If you have only a household use only permit, then you can't. If you don't have a well, like you live in the city, then you cannot capture rainwater.
Can you say that again?
Is anyone ever
Okay, if you have a well in the county, if you have a well and you have a domestic well, so you can irrigate from your well of 1 acre anyway, you can actually capture rainwater. If you have a household use only well, then you cannot capture rainwater. And if you live in city limits or subdivision, you cannot capture rainwater.
How do you know which kind of well you have?
Your permit should say what well you have. And if you need to know what your permit is, you can just call our office.
There you go. Some cities throughout the West, like Seattle, actually encourages it now they've made it legal. Some places like in Santa Fe, New Mexico, it's even become mandatory. Have you ever cited anyone for that? Would you ever like?
We have.
Oh, you have? It really is kind of interesting. Okay. So disregard what I said earlier. Don't capture rainwater. Talk to him. Okay, thank you all for your patience. Thank you for being here.